I want to ask you something. Have you ever achieved something that you were really proud of? Maybe you started a business or you published a book, you lost weight, you left an unhealthy relationship, or maybe even you just simply became happier and more comfortable in your own skin. And then you realize that the people whose opinion have always mattered most in your life barely even acknowledge it. Or worse, they criticize it. And I'm not talking strangers here. I'm not talking, people off the internet, trolls, all that sort of stuff. I'm talking about your own family, your closest friends, your partner. And if that's happened to you, then this video is for you. Because today I want to talk about tall poppy syndrome, but probably not the way that you've heard it explained before. So, here in Australia and New Zealand, we hear the phrase tall poppy syndrome quite a lot. And it describes the tendency to criticize, diminish, or pull down people who stand out, right? Because of their success, their confidence, their achievement, even because of their happiness. And the phrase itself is very Aussie and Kiwi, but the behavior certainly isn't. You'll find it in families, in workplaces, in communities all over the world. And funnily enough, the expression actually dates back to ancient Rome. There's this story where the tallest poppies in the field were cut down as a symbol of eliminating those who stood above the rest. And over time, we adopted, here in Oz, we adopted that image as a way of describing the social tendency to cut people down to size when they become too successful or too visible. And sometimes it's obvious. People make sarcastic comments, they minimize your achievements. They always seem to find fault in what you're doing. You could do this better. But often it's much more subtle. They don't ask questions, they change the subject, they never congratulate you. Or they simply go quiet whenever something good happens in your life. And I've learned that it's not always the criticism that hurts the most. Sometimes it's the silence. Silence can sometimes communicate just as much as criticism. Now, I also want to make an important distinction because not everyone who questions your success is practicing tall poppy syndrome. Sometimes people, they really care about you and they want to offer you honest feedback. And healthy feedback helps you grow. Tall poppy syndrome tries to make you smaller. And one comes from care and one comes from more of a space of discomfort. And I think one of the biggest mistakes and misunderstandings around tall poppy syndrome is that people, immediately say that it must be because they're jealous. And yes, sometimes that is true. But I actually think it's usually much deeper than that. When someone close to us grows, when they change or they succeed, it unintentionally shines a light on places within themselves that they haven't yet explored. Because your success becomes evidence that change is possible. And that's uncomfortable because if you can do it, what does it say about the choices they've made? Most people aren't consciously trying to pull us down. Often they don't even realize what's happening. Some people aren't reacting to your success, they're reacting to what your success awakens inside themselves. And I think that's more of a compassionate way of looking at it. And I think, family can actually be one of the hardest places to experience this because families are systems. And over time, everyone develops a role. We've got the responsible one, the helper, the peacemaker, the achiever, even the one that keeps everything together. And when one person changes, the entire system feels it. And like any system, it naturally wants to return to what feels familiar. Not because anyone's bad, but familiarity is safe. It feels safe. And sometimes we think people are trying to pull us down, but sometimes they're simply trying to pull us back to who we used to be, back to what feels familiar, back to the role you've always played. Because if you change, the relationship has to change. And not everyone knows how to do that. And I'm going to chuck something else out there to ponder because I also believe that we inherit far more than just genetics. I think we inherit beliefs, expectations, ideas about success, ideas about money, about worthiness, about what we're allowed to become. And sometimes the greatest act of healing isn't changing your family, it's recognizing which beliefs belong to them and which belong to you. Because here's something I've noticed. Sometimes people don't miss who you were, they miss who you were for them. And you know what, guys? I've experienced this myself. There's been moments where something exciting has happened in my business, and instead of curiosity or celebration, the response was just criticism or just silence. And it hurts. And it's not because I need applause, but because we all naturally hope that the people closest to us will be happy for us when something good happens. And when that doesn't occur, it can be disappointing. And over time, I realized that something that kind of changed everything. And that was I was asking people to give me something they may have never learned to give themselves. And that doesn't make them bad people. It simply helped me to stop taking it personally because the issue isn't my success. It's what my success represents to someone else. And guys, with me, that my perspective is probably a little bit different because I've always said and I've always been the believer that we're infinite souls having a human experience. And I believe we consciously choose the families that we're born into before we come into this life. And not because they'll always support us, but because they'll provide exactly the lessons our soul came here to experience. And you know what? Some of those lessons are around love or forgiveness or boundaries, needs. Sometimes they're learning how to stop seeking approval from people who simply aren't able to give it. And maybe the lesson isn't getting everyone to clap for you, to support you. Maybe the lesson is learning how to clap for yourself, to support yourself. Because when you truly know who you are, other people's applause becomes a bonus, not a requirement. And the biggest mistake that I see people make is they begin shrinking themselves. They stop talking about their dreams, they stop posting online, they downplay all their achievements. They apologize for succeeding and they make themselves smaller so that other people can remain comfortable. But I'm going to share this with you guys. If your authenticity makes someone comfortable, shrinking isn't kindness, it's self-abandonment. Because here's the truth. Your light doesn't create someone else's darkness. It simply makes it harder for them to ignore it. And that is not your responsibility. So, what can we actually do? I think one of the most important things is to stop looking for validation from people who consistently can't give it. Celebrate yourself. And I don't believe that's arrogance. I think it's gratitude. Spend more time also with people who are inspired by your growth instead of unsettled by it. Notice who are the people in your life who lean in when something good happens to you, and who are the ones that quietly step back. Because success has a funny way of showing you who's comfortable with your growth and who was only comfortable with the version of you that they were used to. And I found that the people who have done their own inner work usually have no problem celebrating someone else's success. In fact, success doesn't reveal who your supporters are. I'd even go as far as saying it reveals who has done enough inner work to celebrate someone else's success without questioning their own worth. Because remember one thing, confidence isn't believing everyone will support you. It's continuing even when they don't. Because the more you become yourself, the easier it becomes to see who celebrates your growth and who preferred the version of you that stayed small. And finally, being misunderstood isn't proof that you're on the wrong path. Don't give up. Sometimes it's simply evidence that you're growing beyond the version of yourself that other people expected you to remain. So, guys, if you're experiencing tall poppy syndrome, whether it came from family, friends, your partner, colleagues, I hope today gives you a different way of looking at it. And it's not from a place of blame, but from a place of understanding. Because I truly believe the opposite of tall poppy syndrome isn't everyone applauding you. It's reaching a point where your sense of self or your sense of worth no longer rises and falls with people's applause. For me, that's what living with your own authority really means. All the time I talk about self-authority. That's what it is, not looking outside of yourself for approval. And perhaps the real invitation isn't to become a shorter poppy so that everyone else feels comfortable. Perhaps it's to stand tall and quietly give permission, give others permission to do the same. Because every time one person has the courage to be more of themselves, it reminds the rest of us that we can too. And remember what I always say, remember who you are, trust what you know, and live from your own authority. Sending you lots of love, guys, and I'll see you next week. Take care.